What if the very officer sworn to protect you was the one pulling the trigger? On March 4, 1995, Antoinette Renee Frank, then an officer of the New Orleans Police Department, entered the Kim Anh restaurant, where her co-worker, Officer Ronald A. Williams II, was moonlighting as a security guard. That night, Frank, alongside Rogers LaCaze, carried out a brutal armed robbery that ended with 3 lives lost, Williams, plus 2 young members of the Vu family who ran the restaurant. She returned to the scene in a police patrol car, posing as a responder, and even asked a survivor, "You saw what happened. You killed my brother and sister." But their recognition of her face would change everything. By the end of this video, you'll understand why Antoinette Frank's name still echoes in New Orleans, and why she remains the only woman on death row in Louisiana. In the early hours of March 4, 1995, the Kim Anh Vietnamese restaurant in New Orleans East was closing down for the night. It was owned and run by the Vu family, people chasing their own version of the American dream, working side by side to build something of their own. On that night, Chow Vu was counting receipts in the kitchen while her brother Cuong came in to pay Officer Ronald A. Williams II, a married father of 2, who was working security there to supplement his modest police pay. At the same time, New Orleans was a city on edge. Crime surged, police staffing was stretched thin, and relations between officers and the community were frayed. It was this very environment, of underfunded precincts and battered public trust, that shaped the backdrop for what was to come. The Vu family lived ordinary lives in extraordinary circumstances, balancing long workdays, caring for each other, and holding on to hope in a city too familiar with hardship. Ha Vu, just 24, and her younger brother Cuong, only 17, were more than faces in a tragedy. They were a sister and a brother with future plans, laughter in their routines, and a family behind them. And then there was Antoinette Renee Frank, a rookie officer who had joined the NOPD in 1993 at the age of 22. She had failed a psychiatric evaluation early on. Even her own psychiatrist had flagged personality concerns serious enough to disqualify her from the force, but a second evaluation, referencing community endorsements, allowed her a second chance. She graduated near the top of her academy class and even earned Officer of the Month honors from a local service club. Still, colleagues found her odd, at times disconnected, ill-suited for high-pressure police work. Tasks beyond routine seemed to unsettle her. More alarmingly, she had formed a growing attachment to Rogers LaCaze, a known drug dealer. They had first met when she handled an incident in which LaCaze was shot. She claimed to be trying to help him, though other officers noted a pattern of closeness. He rode in her car, he appeared at accident scenes, introduced as everything from trainee to nephew. No one knew how far this would go. So on that quiet evening at Kim Anh, the family's hopes continued as usual, unaware that one of their most trusted protectors was about to unravel that safety forever. Shortly after midnight on March 4, 1995, Frank arrived at the Kim Anh restaurant in New Orleans East, where she sometimes worked off-duty security. She approached with a stolen key and walked right past Officer Ronald A. Williams II, a father of 2, who was working as a security guard that night. Inside, she shoved Chow Vu, his brother Cuong, and another employee toward the kitchen. Williams trailed behind, seeking answers, when shots rang out. LaCaze, hidden behind. Williams, fired first into Williams's neck, severing his spine, then continued with fatal blows. Ha Vu, 24, and her brother Cuong, 17, siblings helping with closing, were swept into the chaos. As the assailants demanded money, Frank pulled out the bills Chow had hidden. She hit Cuong with her pistol and shot Ha close range. Then Cuong. The violence was savage, precise, terrifying. Chow and Cuong, stunned, fled to a large freezer in the kitchen, turning off its light. Inside that cold enclosure, they listened to every sound. Gunshots echoed. Frank and LaCaze's footsteps pounded. They could hear Frank rummage through drawers, demanding cash, hitting Cuong, firing shots at Ha, and then the final exchange of silence, too dreadful to imagine. You could almost feel the cold steel of the freezer door, the numbness, the muffled screams. Their breaths are trapped in a dark memory. Then came a sound even more chilling than the gunfire. The wail of a police radio. Sirens in the distance. Frank, now behind the wheel of a police cruiser, pulled up behind the restaurant, acting the part of responder. She strode inside, claiming ignorance, yet her face was unmistakable. Chow and Kwok, trembling in the freezer, recognized her instantly. The officer they thought would save them was the one who had destroyed their world. And with that realization, everything changed. When the first homicide detectives arrived at the Kim Anh restaurant, they didn't expect what they found: an off-duty officer lying lifeless, and two members of a family caught in the crossfire. But the real shock came when the horrific perpetrator turned out to be someone wearing the same blue uniform. That uniform belonged to Antoinette Renee Frank, a serving NOPD officer. The betrayal cut through colleagues and community alike. Investigators began unraveling a series of inconsistencies. Survivors in the freezer, siblings Chow and Kwok Vu, identified LaCaze as the male shooter, and also recalled Frank's presence during the chaos. Detective Rance would later describe the scene as planned from the inside. Then came the physical evidence. Ballistics tied the murder weapon to the police department's evidence room. A 9mm gun Frank had access to. Her official records showed she had received it under questionable circumstances. Her alibi unraveled further when surveillance and eyewitness accounts contradicted her statements. She had claimed to drop LaCaze off and then return home, but records and testimonies showed both made suspicious movements around closing time. 3 critical errors sealed Frank's fate. She underestimated the memory of those in hiding. The Vu siblings didn't just remember her presence, they recognized her face under horrific pressure. The use of a police-owned 9mm gun obtained through access to the evidence room created a direct and damning link between the crimes and Frank's privileged position. Her false timeline, her claim that LaCaze was dropped off earlier that night didn't match pool hall testimony or gas station surveillance. The contradictions piled up fast. Perhaps the most unsettling revelation was the nature of Frank's connection with Rogers LaCaze. What began as an attempt to help or reform him turned into something far more entangled. She had introduced him to co-workers as everything from a trainee to her nephew. Footage and witness statements revealed that LaCaze rode in her car, appeared at accident scenes, and even joined her in taking cash from motorists. At the heart of the investigation, the question that emerged: was Frank the mastermind, or a woman manipulated by those she trusted? The tangled web of loyalty, power, and poor judgment only added weight to the tragedy. Within hours of the massacre at Kim Anh restaurant, the authorities had arrested both Antoinette Frank and Rogers LaCaze. News of the arrest ripped through New Orleans. The community's outrage was not just about the triple homicide, it was the betrayal at the heart of it all: a police officer, sworn to serve and protect, who became the instrument of unspeakable violence. The trust New Orleanians placed in their police force, already strained, felt irrevocably broken. Antoinette Frank's trial formally began on September 5, 1995. The courtroom was tense, pulsating with grief, disbelief, and the weight of public betrayal. Testimony from the Vu siblings was central. Both Chow and Kwok identified Rogers LaCaze as the accomplice and, importantly, confirmed Frank's presence during the murders. They told the jury of frozen moments wrapped in fear: Ha Vu pleading on her knees, Cuong collapsing under gunfire, and then their shock when Frank, the officer, returned in uniform, feigning concern. It was a truth too surreal to ignore, and it cut through the courtroom. Observations from court observers painted Frank as composed, cold, even detached. She neither wept nor drew attention. Defense attorneys, who had subpoenaed 39 witnesses, called none, a decision that raised eyebrows. Yet, in moments when details were recounted, the final pleas, the gunshot echoes, flashes of emotion crossed her face. A tightening of her jaw. A pause, as if looking through the courtroom rather than at it. These rare glimpses humanized her, but only briefly, before the armor returned. The verdict was delivered on September 12, 1995, a mere 22 minutes of deliberation. Frank was found guilty on all counts of first-degree murder. The next day, in 45 minutes, the same jury recommended the death penalty. On October 20, 1995, she was formally sentenced to death and transferred to the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women, the only woman on death row in the state. The sentence came with maximum emotional weight. A community's grief, a family's loss, and the chilling image of blue turning into bulletproof betrayal all converged in that moment. Inmates on Louisiana's female death row endure solitary confinement, locked in their cells for 23 hours a day, with limited exercise, rare social contact, and minimal programming. Despite this, insiders describe Frank as quietly compliant. She never caused trouble, never drew attention, just a ghost among the rows. Over more than 2 decades, testimony about Frank's behavior in custody has been conflicting. A former warden praised her as the best person in our institution, calling her gentle, peaceful, and someone who never complains. She pursued education, served as a peacemaker among inmates, and even embraced spiritual renewal. Yet in the court of public opinion, her demeanor awakened divided reactions. Some saw genuine remorse, others perceived calculation. Her clean record stood in stark contrast to the irreversible cruelty of her crime. Even as Frank remains on death row, her legal battle continues. In 2007, the Louisiana Supreme Court upheld her sentence, rejecting arguments that she lacked access to mitigating experts during sentencing. In April 2025, she gained new life when a state judge accepted her appeal, granting a hearing set for December 2025. Meanwhile, in 2023, she sought clemency alongside dozens of other inmates, pointing to decades of documented sexual and physical abuse from her father, testimony largely unheard at her trial. Yet, the Mississippi Pardon Board denied her request in a 2-2 split after emotional testimony. This is a story about more than cold-blooded murder, it is about trust shattered at the core. New Orleans has long battled with police corruption, and the Antoinette Frank case stands as a stark reminder: the betrayal didn't come from somewhere outside the system, it came from within inside the badge. That single act of violence broke more than bones, it cracked a city's faith in its protectors. Antoinette Frank's psychological profile is chilling. She was diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, a condition defined by exaggerated self-worth, entitlement, manipulative behaviors, and a striking lack of empathy. Faced with financial strain, unstable attachments, and the thrill of power, desperation and narcissism fused into a dangerous force. The badge offered authority. The disorder required attention. And the outcome was tragic. So what does it mean when evil wears a uniform? Was Antoinette Frank a monster acting alone, or a symptom of something deeply flawed in the system that created her? In light of her psychiatric history, hiring irregularities, and the NOPD's desperate need for officers in the early 90s, the line between personal failure and institutional breakdown blurs. This wasn't just a crime, it was a stark reflection of systemic failure meeting personal pathology. And that complexity refuses easy answers. The Antoinette Frank case captured national attention and never let go. Newspapers, magazines, and television programs couldn't resist the chilling irony: a uniformed officer turned criminal. She was featured in such true crime series as Deadly Women, Snapped, Killer, Couples, and I'd Kill for You, each tending to reinforce the narrative of betrayal. In 2020, TV One even debuted a movie inspired by her titled Blood on Her Badge. This was more than a sensational story, it became a symbol of everything that went wrong in law enforcement, a disturbing reflection of trust broken from within. In Louisiana, the memory of the Kim Anh murders remains vivid, even decades later. The Vu family's tragedy lingers as a haunting marker in New Orleans East, especially as Antoinette Frank remains the only woman on the state's death row. Her crimes are not relegated to dusty cold case files, they're woven into the city's painful history of systemic corruption and fear. The fact that Frank's name still echoes through local conversation speaks to the lingering wound, a wound reopened each time the city contemplates justice, redemption, or the limits of mercy. What makes the Frank case truly unsettling within the true crime genre is its rarity. She is a woman, and a law enforcement officer, on death row. Female perpetrators are already scarce in capital punishment, and female officers convicted of murder even more so. Her case stands almost alone in American criminal history, as a collision of gender, power, and the ultimate betrayal. Audiences fixate not just because the crime was brutal, but because it defied the assumptions we hold about who holds power and who wields it against the vulnerable. That dissonance leaves a mark decades after the crime. Tonight you've heard the story of Antoinette Renee Frank, the New Orleans police officer who traded a badge for bloodshed, who left behind shattered families, broken trust, and a city scarred by betrayal. But the question remains, do you believe justice was truly served, or is her story a reflection of something bigger, a system that ignored warnings, enabled corruption, and allowed a troubled officer to wear the uniform in the first place? I want to hear what you think. Was this crime about one woman's choices, or the failure of the system that put her in power? Tell us in the comments. Your perspective matters. And if this case gripped you, hit like, subscribe, and share. Every week, we bring you haunting stories from the darkest corners of justice, stories that demand to be remembered, stories that force us to ask, what does justice really mean?